So listen, here's the deal. Therapists and communication skills experts have spent years developing communication rules and approaches, all in an attempt to help couples improve their communication. But what if I told you that getting the rule right actually is less helpful for your relationship than getting it wrong and then recognizing why you got it wrong? So in this video, I'm going to address 5 common communication rules and show you how breaking them can actually reveal deeper needs in your relationship, according to psychologist Dan Weil. That is today on RelationShots. Hey, welcome to RelationShots. If this is your first time hanging out with us, don't forget to download your free guide to intimacy. You'll see a link in the description area below. This will walk you through 4 areas of intimacy: spiritual, emotional, physical, recreational, and give you some tips on how you can strengthen your connection today. And if you download that, you will also get some free videos and other resources coming your way in your email inbox as well. So don't forget to download that. And on top of that, if you are struggling with communication in your relationship, look in the description area below. I run an ongoing free live 1-hour masterclass on communication periodically, and that might be something that will help you strengthen communication in your relationship. So, as I mentioned in the intro, we have all these rules around communication that, yes, can prove helpful in our communication in our relationships. But I also have found that getting these wrong and understanding why we're getting them wrong actually can have greater benefit to your relationship than if you just apply the rule, get the rule right, and strengthen communication incrementally, but you're never getting to the deeper things that are going on in the relationship. So I'm going to run through 5 common communication rules, and I'm going to give a little twist on them and how even when you get them wrong, they might be a clue to something deeper in the relationship that you've not yet talked about. So here's communication rule number 1 that I'm sure you've heard, and it's simply make I statements instead of you statements, right? You've likely heard this rule before, and the idea is nice and good because you statements tend to feel accusatory. So making I statements can often help your spouse receive the information you're trying to deliver and has a lower likelihood of making them feel defensive, right? If you say, you don't spend time with me anymore, that's usually going to get a defensive response, more so than I feel like we don't spend much time together anymore, or I'm missing the time we used to spend together. The problem with you statements is if you don't understand, they will come across as accusatory, and then you're going to view your spouse's defensive response as an indication that you just can't talk to them about issues. You're probably going to stop trying, right? If you are making you statements, don't realize that they come across as accusatory, and you're met with defensiveness, you're going to decide in your mind, oh man, it's their issue. They just can't receive anything. They just don't want any accountability. They just can't handle the truth, right? When the reality is, a you statement is going to put them on the defensive. So it is true, I statements are great when you can use them. But here's where I want to twist it. If you use you statements, not only expect defensiveness and don't assume your spouse can't be talked to, but watch this. It would be great if your spouse used I statements, but if your spouse uses you statements, instead of responding defensively, I want you to recognize this, that a you statement is a clue to hidden I statements, right? That your spouse may be struggling to show, because guess what? An I statement actually requires some level of vulnerability, transparency. So don't respond with defensiveness. If you are met with you statements, man, don't call foul on that and bow out of the relationship. What I want you to do is recognize that a you statement is actually a hidden I statement, and they're struggling with vulnerability by saying I need, or I want, or I feel. And so I'm going to challenge you to get curious and search for the feelings that are behind the you statements. So again, to recap, if you can use I statements, fantastic. But I want you to understand, if your spouse is using you statements, don't just get defensive. Realize a you statement is a hidden clue to a hidden I statement, and you need to get curious and find out what's really going on underneath. Communication rule number 2 you likely have heard is don't use always and never, also known as universal statements, right? The problem with always and never is that they are exaggerations, and also they're easy to refute, right? If you use never, your spouse is simply going to point to an exception and how they don't have to acknowledge your statement or frustration because it's not accurate, it's an exaggeration. So always and never will definitely provoke your spouse and are easy to dismiss because they're never true. There's always an exception. So if your spouse uses always and never, don't dismiss their statements and point out the exception. Instead, I want you to understand that these words are just stand-ins for deep, painful feelings, and they actually provide a clue to those feelings. And they're an indication that your spouse doesn't feel like they currently have a way to bring up the frustrations in the moment, these feelings. They don't have a healthy way to do it, and so they use always and never. What I need you to do is don't respond with the exception. Again, get curious. Always and never statements can be clues. Should we try to avoid them because they're easy for your spouse to refute and dismiss what you're trying to get across? Absolutely. But if your spouse uses always and never, don't respond with the exception to what they just said. Get curious, because what this is showing is that they probably either don't have the tools, they don't feel safe, or they don't know how to come across with what's really going on, and so they use this exaggerated word. Communication rule number 3, you have likely heard, is don't interrupt your spouse, right? When the other person's talking, it seems like a good rule not to interrupt. Why? Because we all know that interrupting our spouse is probably not going to go well. But we also all struggle with not doing it, right? Especially when we disagree with what they're saying. Interrupting is going to make your spouse angry. That's the truth. It's going to communicate to them that you don't think what they are trying to say is important. And guess what? It's going to make them stop listening to you. But the flip side of this coin, what happens if you don't interrupt? By not interrupting, it also may not be good for your communication, right? You might struggle to continue listening if you don't agree with what they're saying, but you don't interrupt. So you might continue getting more and more angry, and then at the end, you won't respond well when it is your turn. So you see the problem. If you interrupt, your spouse becomes angry, and if you don't interrupt, you may become more and more angry. So let's flip this rule on its head. And I'm going to challenge you to learn how to interrupt without interrupting. All right, let me give you some examples. It's you saying something in the middle like you are making some valid points, but your tone is making it hard for me to listen. So you've kind of interrupted, but you're just sharing with them your experience while allowing them to continue on. You're not interrupting with some new idea or to refute. You're basically just saying, listen, it's hard for me to just keep sitting here with your tone. And if I just keep sitting here with your tone and don't say anything, by the time you're done, it's my turn, I'm probably not going to be in a good place, right? So I interrupt, but I'm not actually interrupting. Or I might say something like this: keep going, but I don't agree with some of your statements, and I'm going to want a chance to respond at the end, right? So it's an interruption without interrupting. So my challenge to you is don't interrupt, but interrupt without interrupting, if that makes sense. All right, communication rule number 4 that we might need to flip on its head is this idea of summarizing what your spouse has said back to you, right? I'm sure you've heard this one before as well. This is where you repeat back to your spouse what you believe they said for clarity and to show that you're actually active listening. So something like, I hear you saying that you feel fill in the blank. Or you say, if I'm understanding you, you are saying fill in the blank, right? And so the summarizing rule is really an attempt to get couples to listen to one another when they find themselves not usually listening to one another. But it can actually distract you from the real issues, because watch this, usually your arguments are not about the things you're arguing about. Okay? You ever realize that? That often what you're arguing about is not what the real issue is. So here's what you need to do. Instead of following this communication rule and summarizing or paraphrasing to each other what you're saying, I want you to do these two things. Number one is recognize that when you stop listening, it's usually because you feel unheard. And so I'm going to challenge you to lean in anyway. Right? Let me say that again. Usually when you stop listening, the reason you stop listening is because you feel like they are not hearing you. And I'm going to challenge you that when you find yourself doing that, pause and lean in anyway. And number two, I'm going to challenge you to focus on listening to your spouse's feelings about the issue instead of getting caught up on the details of the current concern. These feelings likely appear in multitude of different issues in your relationship and are the real concern. So don't summarize. Instead of summarizing, keep listening, recognize when you stop and lean in again, and look for the deeper issues. The feelings that are going on in this argument are probably clues to a deeper issue, and that theme shows up in multiple different areas of your relationship. That's why I say usually the argument we're having is not the real issue. It's just one surface example of the issue and the frustration in the relationship. Communication rule number 5 that I think we need to revisit is the one that says don't mind read. Basically, don't assume. So mind reading is where we make assumptions and assign motive to our spouse's behavior, and then we tell them that what they were doing or trying to do is fill in the blank. Right? That's where you say something like, well, you were trying to punish me, or you were trying to make me mad, or you were doing that because you always want to be in control. And so we are deciding that we know what's going on in their mind based on what they say and what they do, and we jump in and tell them what they're thinking, tell them what they're feeling, or tell them what they are trying to do. Right? And this goes back and forth. I'm sure you've experienced in your relationship. It's like one spouse says, why are you so angry? And you're like, I'm not. And it's like, yes, you are. And they're like, no, I'm not. Like, you sound like it. Well, like, now I am, right? So when you tell the other person they're angry and they're saying they're not, we're mind reading. We're deciding that what we're seeing on their face or their body language or their behavior or what they're saying, we're deciding the meaning behind it. And I know what you're thinking. Well, I've been with my spouse so long, I could just tell. Okay, you may be able to, but if you ask them and they give you an answer, you need to accept the answer. Not tell them that that's not true and then tell them what they're really doing. See, the problem with avoiding this rule is that there is a real thin line between these two things. Watch this. Jumping to conclusions, which is bad, that's mind reading, but there's a real thin line between jumping to conclusions and drawing conclusions, which is good. Got that? So jumping to conclusions is I see some evidence or some clues and I make an assumption and I mind read and I tell the other person what they're doing. Drawing conclusions is I see some clues, I see some behaviors, and I begin drawing a conclusion. So I'm going to say instead of avoiding this rule, don't mind read, I'm going to suggest you that you shift from telling to asking. Instead of saying you are angry, try saying you seem angry, or asking, are you angry? And realize that mind reading statements are often expressions of our own worries or fears, or expressions of our spouse's worries and fears, right? What you feel like they are accusing you of is likely something they are fearful of or worried about. So my challenge to you is don't mind read, but do draw conclusions, which is coming from the same foundation. Mind reading requires us to observe what's going on and come to some conclusion. Drawing conclusions is doing the same thing, but instead of telling, I'm asking. Instead of jumping to conclusions and telling, I'm drawing conclusions and asking. All right, so those are 5 common communication rules that most of us have bought wholeheartedly into that are somewhat helpful. We don't always use them in the moment when we're frustrated. They're somewhat helpful, But I'm proposing that if you violate these, you will actually improve your communication and get to deeper frustrations and feelings in your marriage if you use the violations of these rules as clues to what's really going on. So drop a comment. Let me know which one of these 5 and the breaking of them actually resonated most for you. And then watch us tune in next week, because I'm going to tackle 5 more communication rules and flip them on their head and let you understand why, instead of following this rule, a shift and a tweak or the opposite of it might actually help your relationship in greater ways than if you follow these rules. So there's no need to throw in the towel if you break the rule. Instead, use it as a clue to find the deeper feelings and meanings of what's going on in your relationship. Again, drop a comment. Let's chat about this. And until next time, I'll see you right back here on RelationShots.